Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and A.J. Mathieu.
Welcome to episode 17 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. On this week's episode, A.J. and I share the 3 types of assessment you can use to help your leaders become more effective. Every church wants more and better leaders at every level, but most are skipping out on the key ingredient to having more effective leaders: evaluation. Churches are afraid to evaluate leaders, especially volunteers, because we fear that people will quit or be offended if we talk about evaluation. In this episode, we share why evaluation is so important and how you can leverage 3 specific types of assessment that your leaders won't only not be offended by, they'll fully embrace them. As a result, your church will see improved leadership at every level, from your frontline volunteers all the way to your board. To read today's show notes and to access the freebies mentioned in today's episode, visit malfersgroup.com/17, the number 17. If you like today's episode, please subscribe and share with your friends in ministry. Now, let's dive in.
All right, this week we're talking about evaluating leaders in our churches, and specifically evaluating leaders at all levels of leadership. So from the ground up. And I want to start, Scott, this week by sort of, let's lay a little bit of framework or groundwork here so that people understand kind of where we're coming from or our philosophy on church leadership, because, that's kind of important to understand what we mean by evaluating leaders. So talk to us a little bit about maybe the various levels of leadership that, are going to kind of make up what we talk about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we were going through a leadership pipeline process with your church, and again, this has just been a recurring theme here throughout the last several episodes, we would work with you specifically to define levels of leadership within your church. But if you're not in a place where you're going to be doing that, at the very minimum, you could think of levels of leadership as just like in very basic terms. So sort of volunteer level leadership, frontline type volunteers versus volunteers who are leading other people in some way, versus your staff versus your board. That would be the most simplistic way of breaking that down, right, AJ? We're kind of more specific in a pipeline process. But if you just were to think of it in those 4 buckets to start with: leaders who are just frontline doing tasks, volunteers who are actually leading other people like a small group leader or a Sunday school teacher, that kind of thing. Staff, so people who are directing or leading ministries. This could be volunteer or paid staff, part-time or full-time. And then board level folks, deacon, elder, whatever it is that your structure is at the top. So maybe those 4 buckets just to start with.
Yeah. That's helpful. So I think a couple of other points of clarity that I want to help so that everybody is tracking with us later is that what we're talking about, again, the topic is evaluating leaders. So this is a process or a framework for evaluating both staff and volunteers. So we're not separating out like, hey, we do staff evaluations, and then over here we have this entire other entity in which we do other types of evaluations. This is all a framework of evaluation that is one entity or one process, if you will, in the church.
Yeah, so churches are just historically terrible at evaluating and assessing leaders. I'd say roughly half, or if we were generous, maybe 2/3 of the churches that we work with do some sort of staff evaluations.
That may be fair, yeah, but definitely, I don't know that I've ever come across a church that on their own already were doing any kind of volunteer position evaluations.
Correct, yeah. I'd almost zero conduct any sort of assessment or evaluation with volunteers or with board members. So here's the thing. You can't really be disappointed in the performance of your volunteers or your leadership board if you don't ever evaluate and assess them.
Yeah.
That's kind of on you, right? So today we want to give you 3 types of assessment that you can use to evaluate and assess leaders in your church, from those very frontline volunteers all the way up to your senior leadership board. And yes, like you said, it's sort of a system of assessment that you can apply universally from the ground up that scales, right? So we're assessing frontline folks different than we would a staff or a board person.
So how can we help? Because every time I start talking about volunteer evaluation with church leadership, it turns into like the fear of like the bomb squad If I cut the blue wire before the red wire, the thing's going to explode. And they think if I start evaluating my volunteers, they're going to quit. Like if people don't want to be evaluated. That's what their job is for. They want to come to church and just serve.
Yeah, that's actually totally false.
Walk us through that then before we jump into these assessment points.
Yeah, the first one is going to be solved by our first type of assessment. So I'll hold off on that. But just principally, people want to know where they stand. They do. They want to know where they stand. Like, am I doing a good job? What does a good job look like?
Does it even matter if I'm here? Maybe what some people even ask.
Yeah, people want to know, like, what is it that you want me to do exactly? And how do I know I'm doing a good job? You're telling me people don't want to know that? They definitely do.
Mm-hmm.
And people are more likely to quit because they don't know if they're doing a good job than they are to quit because you're telling them that they are or are not doing a good job. And by the way, if your preconceived notion of evaluation is someone coming in and telling you you're doing a bad job at something, then you have the wrong concept of what evaluation is to begin with. So if we can bust some of those myths through what we're going to talk about today, that might be valuable. But just at face value, people do want assessment if we're doing it the right way. No one does want to be told, here are the 10 things you're doing wrong. But that's not what we're promoting in today's episode.
Yeah, I think that is like 99.9% of the time. That is what comes to people's mind when you start talking about volunteer evaluations. It's immediately a negative connotation. And I'm not sure why that ended up being probably culturally over decades of workforce evaluations. They're just always bad for some reason. And that's not where we're at.
Evaluations tend to be the stick and the carrot and the stick. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
people tend to see that as like the thing you're going to hit me with. And that's not even a good concept of evaluation in businesses, but it's certainly what we have in our minds because we've seen that a lot, but it's not what we're promoting here. So I'm glad you asked that question, AJ, because that is not what we're suggesting that you do in your church with volunteers.
Yeah. Okay, then. So as you mentioned, we've got 3 points of assessment that we're going to walk through today in evaluating leaders. And our first one, assessment number 1, is simply feedback. I guess this is an easy entry-level point of assessment.
Yeah, and these 3 things that we're going to talk about work together as a system. So, I'm not asking you to pick and choose. I'm asking you to do all 3 because they work together. So the first one is feedback. So we got to redeem the concept of evaluation in general by making feedback the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, we don't do this well. We just send folks off on their jobs. They're, even paid people, we do this. And then we rarely give them any feedback on how they're doing unless they totally blow it. So that's why people think feedback's a bad thing or evaluation is a bad thing, is because we're not giving them any sort of a feedback unless it's negative. And if you're a staff person, if the only time you're receiving feedback is during an annual review, what can you as a staff person do with that? You can't improve.
Right.
It's already over, right?
Yeah, now you're on pins and needles waiting for your next assessment or evaluation.
That's right. So you need to give feedback regularly. You need positive and negative feedback. So let me give you a very real world example of something that we used to do in the last church where I was on staff. I'm surprised. I kind of thought this was normal. I thought that everyone did this, and I've since learned that this is not the case, that very few churches do this. But we used to do a pre-service meeting. So we had 2 services. Before first service, we would gather anybody who was involved in the service itself. So not ushers and greeters, but like the whole band, anybody running tech, if you were sort of the host or the MC for the service, if you were preaching, anybody who was involved with the running of the service would come together 15 minutes before the service. And we printed off what we'd call the cue sheet. So if you're using Planning Center, sort of that service order, and we would walk through everything that was going to happen in the service. So we'd talk through everything. We'd talk through every transition. Obviously, we've already gone through sound checks and we've rehearsed all the songs and stuff in band practice the week before. So this is not the first time we're hearing all this, but we're just refreshing our minds on what we're going to do. So here's where the feedback component, that's not really feedback, that's just sort of prep. The feedback component came in. We would do the pre-service meeting before second service also. So we'd get everybody together 15 minutes before the second service, and we would review. We would go through the entire cue sheet again. This time, instead of informing, we'd be making tactical adjustments. Hey, this transition was rough. Let's do this way, or let's do this way, or could you tighten this up or shorten this thing? Or, we need to start making this transition when we get to this point in the sermon or whatever. Like, we can actually give feedback so that second service is better than first service because we can learn from what happened in first service, right? And no one ever thought that they were in trouble. Like, we just wanted it to be better. And that's what feedback should be like. No one's ever in trouble. You're hearing good and bad and making adjustments, and I can be better the next time because I'm getting feedback. And that was just normal course of business for us. So that's what we mean by feedback.
Yeah, that's really good. And a reminder that you should always go to a church with at least 2 services and not go to the first service.
Yeah, always go to second service. It's better. But I'm surprised that lots of churches I know do 2 services and they don't do a pre-service meeting before either of their services, which is shocking to me. It's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, that's great, man. Assessment number 2, we're talking about goals review. And so we're going to camp out here probably a little bit longer on this topic. But, first of all, I guess you can't review a goal unless you set a goal, right, Scott?
Yeah, so let's talk about goals. Let's this is a sidebar conversation, but really necessary about goals in general. Churches really, they like the idea of setting goals. I don't know any pastor or church leadership team that doesn't like the idea of setting goals as a church, but they're usually terrible at executing them. And it's not because the goals were garbage. It's just they fail for 2 reasons. So the first reason that goals fail, this almost could be a whole podcast episode. Maybe we should do one sometime, AJ, on this topic, but I'll give the Cliff Notes version here. Goals fail for 2 reasons. Number 1, because they don't cascade down to your lowest levels. So when you're forming a church-wide goal, you need to always ask this question: how are our frontline volunteers going to contribute to the bottom line result? How is a greeter going to help move the needle on this church-wide goal? If you can't answer that question, then you're not going to hit your goal. Seriously. Like, literally every ministry and volunteer team that you have needs to be contributing in some form or fashion to at least one of your church-wide goals.
Now, that greeter, that person at the door, or the parking lot attendant, what they do probably won't be specifically different for that goal. Part of the value here is the exercise of talking through how every level is affected by goals, or just those touch points.
Let me give a specific example, okay, so that folks can understand this. Let's say we have a church-wide goal on our worship step, okay? Maybe for our worship step and our discipleship pathway, we set a goal that we want to go from 30% of our folks, of first-time guests, attend the Next Steps class to 60%. That's our goal. We want to go from 30% of our folks attend, first-time guests attend the Next Steps class to 60% attend the Next Steps class, okay? So that's a very clear goal. The team that's most likely to help drive that's going to be sort of your hospitality team, right? So greeters specifically can help achieve that goal. How can they help achieve that goal? It might be things like making sure that every person who walks in gets something in their hand, like a bulletin that promotes the Next Step class.
Sure, yeah.
That seem really small, but if you watch your greeters, I know this happens in my church, not everybody who walks in gets a bulletin. Right?
It's unclear sometimes. Are those guys together? Should everybody get one? Head of household only? Yeah.
No, but I'm not even talking about that, AJ. I'm talking about like whole groups of people can walk in and only one person in that group.
Yeah.
So increasing the likelihood that someone gets something in their hand that promotes the Next Step class is going to increase the likelihood that they sign up for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm talking about something that simple, that the commitment that a greeter can make is, I'm going to make sure that every person who walks past me is getting this piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
So that later on when I'm doing a goals review, I can say, hey, how's it going getting, are you having challenges getting those? And then maybe it might say, too many people are walking into the door. We don't have enough greeters at the door for me to be able to get something in their hands, right? So then I can work through that challenge. If my goal is I want to increase the number of first-time guests who are attending Next Steps, and my best way to get them into Next Steps is to get something in their hands for them to sign up, then I need to make sure that my greeters are getting that thing in their hands. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's me taking a big goal for our church and seeing how that translates down to my frontline volunteer. So the second thing is that we don't track progress towards our goals. And if we do, we don't share that with the team. So imagine, for example, AJ, if we were watching the Super Bowl and at the Super Bowl, no one was keeping the score. Like you might mentally be able to, for a while, keep track of who's winning and who's losing, but eventually you would not be able to keep track of who's winning, and that would be pointless. But just as bad, AJ, would be if the coaches kept the score, but no one on the field could see the scoreboard. That would be frustrating. But this is exactly what we do all the time in church. We set goals and we either don't monitor the progress at all, so we don't know if we're winning or losing, or we don't share that progress with the team at all. And so team members from your board all the way down to your frontline volunteers don't know if the church is winning or losing at those church-wide goals that you set at the beginning of the year. And it's impossible to know if what you're doing as a team member is making any sort of a difference.
Yeah, that is almost a direct analogy too, because I mean, everything that we're doing as a church, it involves everybody in the church. That's what our goals are. The church is the people. And so it has to be communicated so that everybody on the team knows whether we're winning or losing against this goal that we've set.
So how do we communicate that? How do we communicate whether or not we're winning or losing? And how do we make commitments so that we can move the needle? Assessment number 2 is a goals review. So here's how to do this. You can meet with team members one-on-one, or you could do it in huddles. So you could do it like a team meeting. Generally, you want to keep that to a group of no more than 6 or 8. If you're meeting with more than that, then you're not able to have dialogue with individual people. So you want to share then progress towards that goal that you've set and how that applies to that team. So maybe it is the bulletins thing. Like you want to make sure every person who walks in gets a bulletin. So in that one-on-one or in that huddle, ask them, how is that going? What commitments are you going to make to improve that system so we're getting the bulletins into everyone's hand? And share progress. Hey, at the beginning of the year, we were at 30%. We're up to 40% of first-time guests are coming in. What you're doing is making a difference. Like share whether or not the church is winning or losing. Everyone that's volunteering in your church needs to know what the score is and how what they're doing is actively moving the needle.
Well, how many churches have we walked into that were running a building campaign and they've got the white paper in the sanctuary on the wall that looks like a thermometer and they're coloring it in red, to these marks? Because that's easy. We need to raise X number of dollars. Here's where we are today.
Gamify the whole thing. Yep.
But we've got to think through. If we're going to set a goal, we've got to be thinking then, how do we assess it and how do we communicate where we're at?
On that note, that's why you can't have 15 goals.
Yeah.
Because you can't track them all. If you had one major goal per area, so like that goal I mentioned of getting people into next steps ties in really well to that worship step. And then there's all those teams that are connected to that worship step. So, your next step might be that grow step, right? So you're going to have a goal set for that grow step. Maybe it's a percentage of average worship attendance that is engaged in a group. So then all the way to all the teams that are connected to that grow step, they're doing things that are connected to that step. But they're not caring about the one that was for the worship step. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They've got one goal that they're driving. So every team only has one church-wide goal that they are personally connected to.
Yeah, the people that need to know.
That's right.
Other people don't necessarily need to know if they're not directly involved with it.
That's correct.
We don't want to have 15 color-in thermometers hanging on the wall in the sanctuary, one for baptisms and one for the nursery wing expansion. And yeah.
This sounds overwhelming. I know it. Like you're sitting in your car and going, it sounds like a lot of work. Let me break it down to you really simply. Every volunteer that you have has just one thing that they care about. It's not overwhelming to them. It might be overwhelming to you to get the whole system set up. Yeah. It's not overwhelming for the volunteer because remember, all that greeter cares about is all I got to do is make sure that every single person who walks past me gets a bulletin. That is not overwhelming for them. It's not. It's overwhelming for you to think through the system of it, but it's not overwhelming for the individual volunteer.
Right. And again, so let me rewind just for a second here. We're on assessment number 2, and this is goals review. But this is goals review in the context of leadership levels in the church. So as you go up on your levels of leadership, you have responsibility over more levels. But when you get down to the lower levels, again, you're taking things off their plate because it's not in their purview to begin with. So
that's right.
It might seem overwhelming at the top of that leadership pyramid, but don't assume everybody beneath you is also as overwhelmed.
It should be. It should be complex. And if you can't handle that level of complexity, you don't deserve to be at that level of leadership.
There you go. Yeah.
And if you're the solo pastor in a smaller church, you've got 4 church-wide goals. One according to each of the steps in your discipleship pathway. yeah, it's kind of on you to be able to track the progress in each of those 4 areas and then sort of monitor the trickle down. Is everybody, at every level taking ownership for the one thing that they're supposed to be doing? That's your job. I know that's a lot. That's tough. Maybe you leverage your board at that point to split up those 4 steps and say, okay, we've got 4 different elders and each elder is going to oversee one of those steps. That might be a way to get some stuff off your plate. But yeah, it is complex and it should be because you're in that position.
Yeah, fair enough. Assessment number 3, Scott, is a 360, but surely you can't be talking about volunteers also.
Yeah, I am talking about doing a 360 review on volunteers. Now, I can hear people tapping away from the podcast. I'm going to break this down, okay? First of all, your very frontline volunteers do not need a 360 review, okay? So let me start there. Their assessment process would end at feedback and goals review, okay? So I'm talking about greeters, people who make the coffee, children's check-in folks, all those folks. You don't need to do a 360. That might be, in some churches, hundreds of people. So no need, okay?
We call those level 1 leaders.
Yeah, or L1 positions, right?
Only they don't lead other people.
They're leading themselves.
They take care of themselves only. Yeah.
That's it. They're responsible to show up 15 minutes before the service or whatever. So take a deep breath. That should eliminate a lot of 360s right off the bat, okay? But anybody who is leading others, so we call these level 2 or L2 leaders, they do need a 360. So they're on the stage leading worship. I'm not talking about choir members. I'm talking about someone who'd be actually leading worship, or they're leading a small group, or they're teaching a Sunday school class, or they're teaching a kid's Sunday school class. Anybody who is leading other people, we call those level 2 leaders, they need a 360. But a 360 for an L2 leader it's barely a 360. It's a 1-page form is what we recommend. We have an example. Maybe we can make that available, AJ, as a download. As a 1-page form filled out by the volunteer themselves and the person who directly oversees them. So if you could call that a 360, typically a 360 requires at least one more person, but we're calling it a 360. And we're talking about a 30-minute conversation about how they're doing in their position. We'd call that maybe capacity competency, sort of their handwork, the work they're doing, but also how their heart is doing, what we'd call their character competencies. How's your heart? And so as you go up in level of leadership to maybe like a staff person or a board member, that 360 would be more intense. Maybe it would be a longer form and more people would fill it out on you. So not just you and the person who oversees you, but someone that you oversee. And it should be more complex as you go further up. But everyone who leads anybody needs to be getting a yearly check on their handwork and their heart work.
And so we might have now volunteers that are leading other people, though. So we haven't moved into like paid staff positions at this point. So talk our listeners down off the ledge again, that we've got somebody that, poor Susan is leading the hospitality team. She's putting in a lot of time doing that. And now I'm going to evaluate her. How's she going to take that?
She's going to take it fine. I'm really tired, frankly, of hearing about people failing out of ministry or burning out of ministry. And these things happen. AJ, you mentioned a story in a previous episode about a couple that volunteered in the children's ministry at your church that eventually stepped down from that because they were burned out.
Mm-hmm.
No one checked on them. They'd have known that if they'd been checked on. You're telling me people in your church who are volunteering don't want to be checked on?
Yeah. And if you have established a culture in which they're comfortable saying, you know what, it's getting kind of tough to make every single Sunday here. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just honestly, if your gut reaction is, oh, it'd be so much work to spend 30 minutes per year doing an assessment with my leaders, you've grossly misjudged what ministry is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Ministry work is people work. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about all of your ushers, your greeters. I'm talking about anybody who's leading somebody else. You need to be checking in on them. That's what Ephesians 4 is all about. It talks about how the leadership gifts were given for the building up of believers to do the work of the ministry. That's what that is. That's building them up. It's checking in on them. So if you're too busy to do a year review of the leaders that you oversee once a year, 2 things. You might be directly overseeing too many people. So I really recommend talking about leadership pipeline and implementing a system like that so that you aren't overseeing too many people. So that is a challenge. And I get that. If that means you'd be doing 40 different reviews, that's too many. And we need to implement a system where you're not directly overseeing that many people. So contact us about Leadership Pipeline. But two, if it doesn't mean that, if it means you'd be doing a review with 8 people and you're like, I'm too busy for that, your priorities are just totally out of whack.
Yeah. Ministry's not easy, is it?
No, it's not.
So sometimes we do have to, just pull our boots up, put our boots on, I should say, and just, get the work done.
Yeah. I mean, leaders do leader things.
Right.
And if you wanted to get into ministry so that you could hide away in your office and write a sermon for 40 hours a week, that's not what the job is. The job is building leaders and developing teams and leading teams and managing people and setting goals and tracking goals and sharing your progress and where you're at. If none of that sounds attractive to you, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah.
That's the work.
Yeah. And it's not as scary as it seems right now. It's different. Different is not always negative and different's not always scary. But the upside to this is huge. The upside is a more unified ministry. The upside are more invested volunteers. The upside are more rested volunteers. And you're going to see an improvement at all levels of your ministry.
Yeah, well, the proposition that we make with Leadership Pipeline is we want to help you develop more and better leaders. And this is sort of the better part. If you want to have better leaders in your church, you got to be evaluating them. Mm-hmm. And creating a system for evaluation and assessment is critical towards being able to have more and better leaders in your church.
So let's run back through these here real quick, Scott. Assessment number 1 was feedback.
Yep. So just consistently give feedback on how people are doing and make that normal. So you're doing that week to week, day to day, just as a normal course of business.
Probably a culture shift to some extent, but I think an easy one to accomplish. Assessment number 2 is goals review.
Yep. So this is assuming that you're setting goals and that you're defining exactly how is an individual team member moving the needle on that goal, all the way to cascade that goal all the way down. And a goals review is simply checking in. And again, with a frontline volunteer, that's going to be once a quarter. Actually, with any of your volunteers, that's going to be once a quarter. It'd only be more frequently than that if you were a staff person. And you're just telling them the progress church-wide, here's how we're doing. And then you're asking them to make a series of commitments for their own improvement. How could I get better at driving this forward?
Mm-hmm. And then finally, our third assessment point of a 360 review.
Yeah, this is a key point. I actually didn't mention this. So I am a big proponent of just setting up quarterly meetings, either one-on-one or in a huddle. And so 3 of those would be goals reviews, and then 1 of them would be a 360. So you're meeting with your volunteers once a quarter, 3 times, that's a goals review, 1 time, that's a 360.
Yeah.
And that's just checking in on them. How are they doing with the work? That's their capacity, competency. And then how are they doing in their heart? That's checking their character and how they're doing in their walk with the Lord.
This is maybe a challenging sounding shift for you to make in your church, but we promise it is doable. Of course, we're here to help in any way that we possibly can. We believe in this as really being a key component in you helping your church drive forward on mission and vision. You can't really separate this out of almost any church that has found success in becoming powerful disciple makers and seeing their people really grow in maturity. You can't separate this out from those kinds of results. So we really do encourage you to take this on. So thanks for joining us this week. For show notes to read Scott's article on evaluating leaders, jump over to malforsgroup.com/17. Scott, is that what where we're at?
Yep. The big
17. Yeah. So that's malforsgroup.com/17. And we sure are glad that you joined us this week on the Church Revitalization Podcast. We'll be back again next week with another fresh topic for you. Scott, thank you so much for the article. And we hope that you'll share this with your other friends in ministry. Please leave a comment on any platform that you have that ability to. And be sure and subscribe for upcoming podcast topics. We love you. We thank you. We'll see you next time.